This first topic in this track is about your first year as a professor, probably to be more technical, assistant professor. So both Nathan and I, my name is Courtney Monroe, by the way, just completed our first year as assistant professors, faculty at our respective institutions. And before I get started, I'd first like to thank the ACSM Student Affairs Committee for asking us or giving us the opportunity to share some of our insights. And we want to thank all of you for being here as well. And so I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. And a little bit about my background: I completed a master's degree in exercise physiology at Illinois State University. And then I taught for 2 years as a lecturer in exercise physiology at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And then I decided to get a PhD at the University of Tennessee. I worked with Dr. Dixie Thompson there and in exercise physiology. And I really got into behavioral science, particularly physical activity promotion, and wound up doing my dissertation using a technology-based physical activity intervention for adults. And then I transitioned into doing a postdoc at the University of South Carolina in the Technology Center to promote healthy lifestyles. And so I pursued that opportunity in part because I was able to get additional training on technology-based weight loss interventions. So it was complementary to physical activity promotion, of course. And then I did that for 2 years, and then was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to transition into a faculty role. And I'm actually in a different department from what I did in my postdoc. So the Tech Center is in the Department of Exercise Science, and now I'm currently in the Department of Health Promotion, Education, and Behavior.
Okay, I am Nate Jenkins, and I, like Courtney said, am currently an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And a little bit about my background, I guess. I did my master's and PhD in exercise physiology and nutrition at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I graduated in 2016, and then actually took a job as an assistant professor at OSU. Kind of my specialty and area of interest is neuromuscular physiology. And yeah, I guess it probably covers the need to know.
So I'll quickly just give a little bit of a summary of my first year, and it might spark some questions if you don't already have some that you're thinking about asking. But as you all know, or may or may not know, going into a faculty position, so the University of South Carolina, of course, is in what would be considered an R1 institution, so very research-oriented, but I do have teaching responsibilities as well. So in my particular department, it's what would be considered a 1-2 or 2-1 course load, meaning teach 2 classes one semester, one another semester. But of course, as time goes on, if you have the opportunity to get grants and so forth, that may change a little bit. But there are those expectations, of course, of research, so writing grants, manuscript writing, and so on, and then also the area of teaching, as I just mentioned, and then also service to the department, to the college, to the university, and even the greater community in some cases. And so I knew that, of course, going into the role. What I didn't know, and what kind of came about during the first year, were so many other little things that pop up that you don't necessarily anticipate, but they're good things, they're good opportunities, and so you just have to figure out how that can fit into your overall plan. For example, some other things I did in addition to those 3 areas, I supervised some practicum students who are completing the master's program. I helped advise master's students in the MPH program as well. There are a number of professional development opportunities to take advantage of at the university for new faculty, and you'll get different requests and things from colleagues who may want you to be involved in different projects. So you are constantly weighing different collaborative opportunities and how they can meaningfully fit within your plan and also perhaps be mutually beneficial to those who are presenting them to you, or you might be presenting them to colleagues. And then there's just the role of students, recruiting students who are interested in being in the program, working with students who may not even be your own as well. And so there are just a number of different things that come your way that you don't consider block into those 3 big areas that you are actually anticipating. And so that sometimes is interesting to try to juggle. But as I said, they can also be great opportunities as well. So that's kind of how my first year played out. It was, for the most part, what I anticipated. Some other things I didn't quite as much, but it all worked out. And you don't realize sometimes I was fortunate enough to have good preparation, a lot of mentorship, and you'll hear that, Stella talked about it. Others will say how important mentorship is, and that doesn't stop when you become a faculty member, obviously. And so I was actually assigned 2 mentors within my department who I met with on a monthly basis throughout this year, which was absolutely great. It allowed me to ask questions that we had a scheduled time to do that, but I could also do that more informally when I needed to. But then there are mentors, old, new, that you rely on to throughout the year. So that's also very important, to not be afraid to ask questions. And it doesn't even have to be faculty members or fellow colleagues. Staff members at the university are really helpful. So it's important to not be afraid to ask questions, get to know everyone who works within your realm.
You ready for questions already?
Yes,
Sure.
questions. Yeah.
Nebraska?
Yes.
Me too.
Okay.
I graduate next year PhD in neuroscience.
Okay.
Which leads into my next question, is that what made you decide to or not to pursue a postdoc or go straight into faculty positions? And any reasons for either one of those decisions?
Good question.
Especially now given the climate of more challenging financing in the grant department.
Sure. Well, I guess a couple things probably influenced that for me. Can't hear me? I think a couple of things probably influenced that for me versus somebody like Courtney maybe. One, I think just historically coming out of our lab, postdocs just aren't something that we typically consider as our first option, honestly. Typically, we've had a lot of success as a lab coming out as doc students and being placed into academic jobs, and so I think that played a huge role, honestly. From just a preparation standpoint, to be perfectly honest, I feel like my mentors did a very, very good job of preparing me as a teacher and as an independent researcher. And so things like publication numbers and being well published and being able to develop and design and carry out a study and mentor grad students of my own to do the same I felt well prepared to do that. And so for those reasons, I think going into a faculty role right out of my PhD program made sense for me. Now for others, that might not be true, right? And I can't say that I didn't think about a postdoc, but I think for me, it just made sense. So, that might not be true for everybody, obviously, and I think it's going to make sense for some people and not for others. So.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So when I was finishing my PhD, I considered both postdocs and applying for faculty positions, and I actually did do both. So I kept everything pretty open and just tried to figure out if an opportunity did come my way, would that be a good fit, whether it was a faculty role or a postdoc. And actually, I really can't say from the outset, I know for a fact I want to do a postdoc and I want to work at an R1 institution. I didn't. I kept, again, all my options wide open. And so, like I said, I looked for, at that current moment, what was the best fit going to be when the opportunity was presented. So when the position at University of South Carolina in tech health came about, I was already doing that research, of course, and it, like I said, allowed me to get into a complementary area so I could get some additional training, cast a little bit of a wider net for my research focus. And so it really just ended up, out of the options that were available to me, to be the best fit. And so I just went for that, and it turned out to be great for me overall. Anyone have any other questions? Yes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Associate Professor and Miss Associate Professor. My name is Sridan Sai. I'm from Monroe University, People's Republic of China. I will do my PhD program in September. I have a question about what do you think is important for a PhD program?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? What would be important?
What is the most important factors for success PhD program?
Okay, I see. What would be the most important factors for success in a PhD program? Okay, yes, thanks, thank you. Do you want to?
Sure. Man, that's a loaded question. Well, I think first, first, I don't know if you've decided on a PhD program, but first, obviously, I think seeking out a mentor in a research area of interest or something that you are passionate about is probably critically important. That's step one. Success in a PhD program, man.
Well, no, you're right that there's so many different factors, of course, and you don't always know how it's going to unfold for you going into it, just like with anything. But for one, I would say that is really a critical time to try to take advantage of different opportunities. So to not just stay in your bubble of you and your mentor and whoever might be in your lab, but to really try to seek out some other professional development types of opportunities if they come about, other collaborations if they come about, if it makes sense for what you're doing. That is really the time to focus on building a solid foundation for yourself. So I wouldn't, it's very intense if you're working hard and doing it right. It's very intense to do a PhD program, of course. But again, that is kind of what you're dedicated to, and you might as well take full advantage of that and other opportunities that come about during that time period to help, like I said, build the foundation for what may end up being your career. I would definitely say that's one important.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think, when I talk to my doc students, so I guess a little bit of background for me, and kind of echoing off Courtney, I guess, she talked about kind of looking for doc students and things like that. I was actually lucky enough that a couple had sought me out prior to my arrival at Oklahoma State. So I've actually been working with doc students already in my first year. But one thing that I kind of make a point of saying is that you're going to be eat, breathing, and sleeping this stuff for 4 years, right? I mean, there's no and ifs, ors about that. So be prepared in that way, and I think to get as much out of the program as possible, which I would highly, if you're going to do it, go all in, right? Jump all in and do it all the way. And so, just kind of echoing on what Courtney said, I think that's very important, and be ready for it to be intense.
Yeah, and one more thing, the programs will vary, of course, depending on exactly what specific area of focus you're going into. So obviously we're in 2 different areas of focus, and you might be in a big lab, you might be in a smaller lab. So that also kind of helps drive what constitutes factors for success as well, I think. But as long as you work hard, and I think another thing obviously that's big is focusing on writing, of course, is important, but I've known people who were co-authors and maybe had some of their own publications coming out of a PhD program. Again, maybe that's expected in certain areas. And then there's other situations where, maybe that's not quite the case. Maybe, somebody's not in a bigger lab and so on. But that doesn't mean you still can't be successful. If you're working hard, you take advantage of opportunities, you do what you're supposed to do, you should be fine. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. My question is, during your first year, how do you juggle all of your class preps with setting up your lab, with recruiting more students? So this might be more of like a personal tactic, but that's fine. Like, how did you guys go about doing all those things simultaneously? And if you have suggestions, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's probably the hardest adjustment for me, honestly. It's coming from, for me, in a lab that's very busy and pretty productive, and coming into a new place and having to set up your own lab and get your own doc students going, and you still have dissertation data, that's sitting on the back burner, and then you're also prepping for courses. I teach a 2-2. I guess I didn't mention that, but so you're prepping courses to some degree. The nice thing is one, hopefully you have some mentors and people that have taught similar classes, or maybe you've taught similar classes in the past that hopefully help with your course preps, and hopefully that helps the transition a little bit. I think, as far as me going into Oklahoma State, there's already, a decent amount of equipment there that I use, and so we were able to actually hit the ground running pretty quickly. There's already projects off the ground with a colleague of mine at OSU, and so I just kind of was able to hit the ground running. I wasn't having to basically start from absolute ground zero, which helped tremendously, honestly. And that's obviously not going to be the case for everybody. And if I wasn't at Oklahoma State, it probably wouldn't have been the case, honestly. That's just kind of the way it is set up there. So to answer your question, how do you juggle that? I don't know. I don't know how I did it. I can't say that I have a strategy. I just did what it took to get it done. I think that's kind of probably going to be my answer to everything that you would ask. Whatever it took is what it's going to take to do it, and so I did it. And that might mean that I'm coming home late and my wife's not necessarily happy on some nights, but I can't say that I recommend that either. But honestly, that's kind of was my strategy. So.
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of in the midst of that right now still even. So even though I transitioned at the same university from postdoc to faculty, there were still actually challenges that I had to face moving from those different positions. So the nice thing, of course, was that I didn't have to worry about the logistics of getting set up or moving to a new community. But like I said, I was in a different department, so I had to get acquainted and acclimated to that new department, to my colleagues in that department. And when you talk about this, setting up your lab and so on, managing startup funds is another big thing. So these go into the category of, as I was saying earlier, all these other things that you don't consider necessarily or that aren't at the forefront of your mind when you're a student or a postdoc. And now Stella mentioned earlier too, no one necessarily trains you on how to do any of that. So you just have to rely on, you have to remember probably, if you've gotten to that point, you've obviously done this before in some fashion. You didn't always know what it was going to be like going into a master's program, going into a PhD program, but you find a way, like Nate was saying, to get things done. And so I also, what I've tried to do, and this sounds cliche, but I really have an overall plan. A couple of my mentors said, even if you know what you want to do goals-wise, write them down, write down deadlines, and really try to stick to them. And so that's what I've tried to do, and included in that plan is like what you brought up, setting up the lab and so on. And I tried to just, on a weekly basis, it's very fluid, try to determine what do the priorities need to be for this time being. And that might shift on the list from week to week, but that's what helps you. I mean, you just get it done. You get it done somehow.
Abby, I'm a fourth-year PhD student from University of Illinois Champaign. So my question is, before you decide what you need to apply to a postdoc or a faculty job, how did you decide either you want to apply for a research institution or a teaching institution or half and half? What factors do you need to consider before you make that decision? And then one more question is it possible that you start from a teaching institution and transit to a research institution in later of your career?
Yeah, good question.
My answer to that is that research is a really big part of what we do. It's a really big part of why I even wanted to do this, right? I fell in love with research, and I fell in love with the idea of mentoring doctoral students. And so mentorship is a huge deal for me and kind of my history. I can't speak highly enough about the mentorship that I received as a doctoral student, and I want to be able to do the same for my own doc students. And so even when you're talking about priorities and things like that, one of the things from my first year it's a change, a shift in mentality, right? Where basically your priority is kind of yourself, honestly, through your doctoral career and trying to get through it and finish your dissertation and get the pubs out that you need published and whatever to prepare yourself for the job. It's a complete 180 once, at least for me, when I got to Oklahoma State and all of a sudden I have my own students and they are my priority, right? For me, I guess the answer to that, Oklahoma State is an R2, right? I think with aspirations to be an R1, essentially. But there's a level of research expectation there, and it's basically 50-50. So it might not be quite South Carolina. Just I guess to answer your question, that's what kind of drove it for me, right? At first, I loved research, one, and two, it gives me the opportunity to do research and mentor doc students. And so for me, those were critical factors. Three, can you go from a teaching to a research institution? That's kind of a loaded question too. It probably depends on who you are a little bit. It's hard. I would say it's hard. I mean, honestly, me coming out, I wouldn't want to go to a school where I'm teaching a 4.4 and not have any GAs and basically have to build a vita, right? And be doing research so that I could get to a research institution. That's difficult. That's very hard. It's hard enough when you have doc students and you're mentoring them. So to go from a 4.4 and be collecting your own data and having to publish and try to prepare yourself with a vita good enough to get you to an R1, I can't say I'd recommend that. So hopefully that answers your question to some degree. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, so when I was trying to, like I had said earlier too, I was kind of trying to figure out what would be the best fit for me. I didn't necessarily have this narrow focus of I for sure want to do research, or I for sure want to do more teaching. So I'd already taught at Old Dominion. I loved teaching. I knew I loved that. As I went through the PhD program at Tennessee, I also then fell in love with research even more. And so at the time when I was applying, I was thinking, well, my ideal might actually be to have more of a balance of the two. But once I got into doing the postdoc, what I love about the research aspect of it is that everything is constantly new. There are all these new opportunities to get involved in different projects. Nothing ever gets stale. And so your passion for the job just is very natural. And again, it's not for everybody, but that's what I like about it. Not to say that teaching would get stale if you're just fully teaching, but you are guaranteed that with research, you're always going to have these new projects to pursue if you find an area that you're really passionate about. But then on top of that, even at the R1 institution, at least, again, I can only speak from my experience in the particular situation I'm in, but I still do get then the opportunity to teach and mentor students, and so I love everything about that. And then about moving from a more teaching-oriented school where maybe you're not doing any research to a more research-oriented institution, what's the possibility of that happening? I would agree with Nate. So at Old Dominion, I was doing a 4-4 teaching load, and I can't imagine, it would be nearly impossible to do some sort of research to try to keep a continuation of research going that might, be attractive or make you more attractive to jump to a more research-oriented institution. Not to say it hasn't been done. Again, I have no experience in doing that, obviously. So, but I think it would just be very challenging to do.
Hi, my name is Nicholas, and I've studied in Wellington, New Zealand. My question is, I'm finishing up my PhD right now, and I'm at the point where I'm looking at what you just talked about, deciding to do a postdoc or getting the market for teaching. What like agencies do you use? I know there's website service. Do you recommend any certain agency or certain websites? I've been in New Zealand for about 3 years now, so I kind of missed the window there. I'm keeping up to what to use. I use Inside Education, Higher Ed, but other than that, do you recommend any other agencies or websites to use?
Yeah, I mean, Higher Ed, Chronicle, the Chronicle, Chronicle Vita. Those are probably, but I mean, professional organizations too, for sure, especially like postdoc opportunities. I see, I'm part of the American Physiological Society, APS, and I see postdoc opportunities coming through like every single week, opportunities for postdoc opportunities. So I mean, things like that, professional organizations and websites like that are geared towards higher education are definitely going to be your best bet, I would think. That was for me anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, higher ed was definitely the main one for me that I perused when I was looking for opportunities. I believe there's one also called Scholarly Hires, I want to say. I can double check on that, but I think that's what it's called, similar. And a lot of times you'll see the same opportunities being posted across the different platforms. And then yes, the professional organizations, of course, and then of course through networking, getting to know people and just asking around, letting them know that you're out on the market looking for positions. And then I think this brings up another good point as well, is, as most of you know, if you're in grad school or have applied to grad school before, just like with that, usually when you're looking for jobs, they come out about a year in advance of when you'd actually start the position. So most of them really start coming out in early, mid-fall, and then that job season continues through the spring in many cases. So always kind of be on the lookout well in advance of different opportunities.
Hi, I'm Joel Blanchard from Quebec, Canada. I was wondering, last year, what was your biggest challenge? Like, seriously.
Single biggest challenge.
This past year as our first year as our first year professor.
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'll probably come up with another biggest challenge like tomorrow after I tell you this one. But I would say for me, it really has been deciding how I want to manage and apply my startup funds, because you kind of feel like, so I actually have to use my funds within 3 years, the first 3 years. And I imagine, I'm not sure if that's typical at other institutions, but so for me, trying to continue to develop my own independent line of research, and really thinking, okay, I have all these ideas for projects in which I'd want to use and apply my startup funds, and this goes back to thinking of kind of my overall plan, my short-term, long-term goals, but really figuring out how I want to use that wisely. And so I spent a lot of my first year networking with people at the university, trying to get a feel for what new collaborations I could potentially form, even outside of the ones I had formed as a postdoc, and also trying to narrow down or refine exactly which ideas I would want to pursue for projects in which I use my startup funds to get those going. And to me, that was probably the biggest challenge. Now that I'm at the end of the year, I feel like I have it figured out. Things are kind of falling into place, and I think I'll be okay with that. But that was definitely, for me, probably the biggest thing.
I definitely didn't have any trouble spending startup. I think I probably had thought about it quite a bit, probably heading into my in my last year as a doc student, and so I had a decent idea of what I wanted to buy, and so probably a little bit different. I think really probably the biggest challenge, and my mentor used to say this all the time when I was a doc student, is you're never going to have more time than you do now, and you think he's crazy because you're like, I don't have any time, and he was right. And so I think that has been, I think you had asked about juggling all of it, and it's hard to find solid time and solid chunks of time, I guess, when you're a new faculty and you've got your meetings and
yes.
New faculty development stuff and all these things that are either required of you or highly required. And you're mentoring students and teaching new classes and things like that. And so I think that was probably the biggest challenge, or I guess if you will, or adjustment, is really, you learn to manage time pretty well as a doctoral student, and you learn to manage it even better as a first-year assistant professor, probably. And so I think that was probably the toughest adjustment for me, honestly.
And obviously us having two different so I do mainly behavioral interventions, so it doesn't, and tech-based ones, so it's not a traditional science lab per se. So that's, I think, why the startup funds were the biggest challenge for me, because I can, of course, use that money for a lot of things, but I don't have a lot of lab equipment or things like that. So
yeah, it's a little bit different.
A little bit different areas.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Nathan D'Amico, and I just finished my first year of my PhD at the University of Arkansas. I just want to say again, thank you so much for all that advice that you're giving us.
Sure.
Obviously, both of you have both research and also teaching responsibilities. So my question is in regards to teaching philosophy and mentoring styles. Can you please briefly describe what they are and kind of how you've established them and what you've kind of found works and kind of doesn't work?
Man, okay. Teaching and mentorship. Well, okay, so I'll start with the mentorship style part of it, honestly. I think that I kind of already said it's really, really important for me, and I think I had a really good example and was trained well in that way. And basically the mentorship style that we use, I basically worked right next door to my mentor and I had a daily interaction with him, right? And to be perfectly honest, one of the things that takes away my time, because I said my students are a priority, and I really do mean that. And that means daily interaction. And that means that, that means things that I want to get done don't necessarily get done because I'm making sure they have what they need or they're rolling on their stuff, right? So I think from that standpoint, it's a very interactive mentorship style. I see them every single day. We're working back and forth on a daily basis. Writing, I kind of stress writing and think that we should be writing a lot and often as doc students. And so kind of the style that I was trained under is basically a paragraph by paragraph. And we basically turn paragraphs back and forth, and hopefully usually it's on a daily basis. So I think mentorship style, that's kind of it. And I have pretty high expectations for my doc students, and I expect them to be highly productive. But that doesn't mean that I basically say, you need to be highly productive and turn them and let them go, right? I mean, it's very much we are working together one-on-one on a daily basis, and that requires something of me. And then for teaching philosophy, do you want to start with that? Sure.
Yeah. So teaching philosophy for me, I taught all undergraduate classes when I was at Old Dominion in their exercise science area. And so I had some really large classes, over 100 students. I had more upper level, smaller class sizes. And so my philosophy usually is the same across the board, but it will vary a little bit depending on if it's undergraduate. And now at South Carolina, so I had a course release my first semester, meaning I didn't teach any courses that helped me get my research off the ground. I was slated to teach a course in the spring, and long story short, it actually got shifted to the fall, so I'll have 2 in the fall, and both of those will be graduate courses. So I think my philosophy for those will be slightly different than how I approach undergraduate, of course. Much higher expectations, more writing intensive, just as you probably experienced in a lot of your graduate classes or will. But I'm also, regardless of undergrad or graduate, one of my things is really making the material relevant or applying it in an actual practical situation, not just lecturing, memorizing topics. I really try to find ways, activities, ways to get students engaged and see how they can actually apply the material. And that's true at any of the levels. And so a lot of times that requires a lot of work up front in preparation, of course, but that's one of my big tenets of my teaching philosophy. And then mentorship style, just to add, it's very similar to what Nate said, and then just to add one other thing on that, he talked about daily interactions. When I've had mentors throughout my career, we always had scheduled meetings. I think that's so important because you can have all the intentions in the world of trying to interact and make sure you're on the same page, and sometimes that works, but actually having a meeting on a calendar, and it could be a walking meeting or anything to kind of mix it up a little bit, but that was greatly helpful for me as a student, and so that's what I would like to do when I mentor students as well.
Okay, so one final question, because we have to wrap up and change out topics here with speakers. We kind of painted some of this as dark and gloomy your first year as a professor, so how about each of you say what was your highlight of your first year as a professor to wrap it up?
Man, I keep talking a lot about mentorship, and kind of being able to basically run my own lab and mentor students in that lab is far and away probably the highlight for me. Yeah, I wouldn't trade that. So easily the highlight.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I've always loved teaching, mentoring students, and it's fun. And even though it's definitely challenging being a professor, of course, you love doing it. It's if you're really passionate about it, it's not all that bad at all, actually. It's really great. And I would say then probably a highlight for me too was I am very lucky and fortunate to be in a great department and be surrounded in both the center and my department by people that I love interacting, collaborating with, and working with. And that goes from staff, administration, faculty. And that just makes everything I do more efficient, more enjoyable than it already is for me. So it's always the people. The people were the highlight for me, getting to know more people and new people.
So in other words, she's a people person. With that, thank you to the speakers, and we will recognize.
Yeah, and can I add one more thing? I will say, so I'll be representing South Carolina at the lab fair. So seriously, if anyone's interested in talking or wanting to know more or interested in my particular lab, I'm recruiting graduate students, PhD, and even masters, just let me know. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys.